So I just want to thank you for joining today. I'm really excited, and it's kind of funny because this whole idea of relapse prevention is getting exemplified in us trying to problem solve this issue right at the moment. Because obviously, I'm feeling a little anxiety of making it right and starting it on time and things like that. So I'm having to go through my own process of working through that. So you get to see me do it in the moment. So what I'm going to do today is just do a brief review of kind of what we've done before. We're going to define relapse, and then I'm going to present the Marlatt Model of Relapse Prevention. If anybody is interested, there is an article. You can just Google Marlatt Model of Relapse Prevention PDF, and it will come right up. This is from a 1999 article that he and a group of others wrote together. So I didn't get the citation in here, but I definitely wanted to make sure that everybody knew where I was getting my data from. And we'll talk about my viewpoints on applications of this model, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions. So I'm going to start off. Oh, the lovely aspen trees. I'm going to start off just with a quick review. So there have been 4 other webinars prior to this, so it's always important for me that this is a building upon, and I want people to remember, if you haven't seen the other ones, you can go back and look at them. This is the first time that I've done all 5 of these in a row, so they're kind of works in progress. I'll probably be doing this again with a refined version of the presentation. So it's important to remember the work you've already done. We did a long talk on the origins of attachment and codependency. We had to talk about the change process and boundaries, the idea of co-recovery. And I am going to go through these slides fairly quickly because there's a lot of information, and I will be available for questions and or emails if or even a phone call if somebody wants to call me directly and ask a question. But this idea of co-recovery, that the addict, we're talking about addiction and families with addiction. So this idea that both parties need to have a sense of recovery as they walk through this process is super important. We talked about that challenge and support needs to be balanced. Too much challenge and not enough support, or too much support and not enough challenge is not a good mix. So we always want to try to balance those things. The idea that slow, methodical, incremental change is much more lasting, predictably, than epiphanic change or epiphanal change. We've all had experiences where we've had a sort of a light bulb moment, and sometimes those things come and they stick. But most often those epiphanies don't have the lasting effect that a very slow, incremental, mindful change does. We talked about balancing challenge and support in the co-recovery. And you'll all get this in the PDF version of this. So a couple webinars ago, we talked about the difference between supportive and enabling behaviors. And I've got a couple of slides of examples of juxtaposed sort of ideas between what's supportive and what's enabling. A little bit of a list of enabling behaviors, some supportive behaviors. And these are always the ones that I want to focus on: trust, loving detachment, healthy boundaries. These are common phrases. Authenticity. These are common phrases in the recovery world from both sides of the picture. 2 times ago, we also talked about the stages of change, which is a basic model of change that's very influential in how I do therapy. And that's from Prochaska and DiClemente. You can also Google that and find numerous versions. Right now, we're pretty much going to be in the preparation stage of change because we're sort of preparing on how to implement some of these changes. And one of those changes is how to manage my relapse potential. This is my circular version of that. And the idea is that we don't want to bounce back and forth between relapse and action. We want to go from preparation to action, relapse, and if we do have a relapse, we go back into preparation. Hopefully, eventually, we're doing that in the maintenance phase and we're not experiencing relapse. And then ultimately, we exit this model by internalizing the processes that we've learned. Transactional analysis was with the communication. So parent, adult, child, critical parent, nurturing parent, not okay child, and positive and negative traits of each. So in that, we were talking about the idea that it's important not to have cross transactions. And the idea is not to have parent to child transactions, but to try to move ourselves into an adult state and have adult to adult transactions. So that was part of that communication talk. And then the last piece of that, I'm going to back up for a quick second. Most of this is talking about the relationship between a person and their loved one, but I really believe that the most important relationship is the one that we have with ourselves, because that informs all of our outside relationships. That's like the super fast review. So this is about relapse prevention. So the first thing we need to do is define what relapse is. These first four statements are from Merriam-Webster. The last one is from the Encarta Dictionary that I got a few years back. So the reason I bring this up is to show people that when we talk about the word relapse, invariably we think it's about addiction and we think it's about using substances. The fact is that relapse can be a number of different things. So it's just the act or instance of backsliding, worsening, or subsiding back into a previous behavior, recurrence of symptoms. With codependency and attachment, those symptoms would be enabling, over problem solving, over loving, things like that. Someone who's suffering from a disease, and this part of it is that can't really define codependency as a disease, but it certainly is an affliction, a condition. But to suffer a deterioration after a period of improvement. And so, and then this last one, to fall back into a former mood state way of life, or especially a bad or undesirable one, after coming out of it for a while. So what's important about this is that a relapse is really going back to something that I said I didn't want to do, or not doing something that I said I did want to do, like exercising, right? Relapse does not necessarily refer to just substances, even though when everybody, typically when someone hears the word relapse, they think about, they drank again or they used again, or something like that. So it's really important to sort of explore as a person, and I'm assuming that the people here have loved ones or they're in a family with somebody who's struggling. And so to think about what your idea of relapse is and what your relapse process looks like is super important to, it's super important to do that self-reflection. Because when a person in recovery from substances has a person in their life who is also working on themselves, it's actually an encouraging thing. So, and we'll kind of keep referring to this as we go. So what does relapse look like for a person who struggles with substances? Well, number one, it's enabling, which is basically protecting someone from the consequences of their behaviors, good or bad. I pay their rent, I do their laundry, etc., things like that. It's also letting go of healthy boundaries. And so at times, family members, they'll set these strict boundaries, but they're unable to keep them because they get stressed and they let them go, and the situation is too difficult for them to manage, and so they just drop their boundaries and they have a relapse of enabling. They will overhelp without asking or being asked. They will over problem solve without being asked. This is a huge one for a lot of people, and it's not just people that have addicts in their life. I'm sure everybody knows a person in their life that will not stop solving other people's problems. So it's one of the tenets of recovery is to let somebody else do their own inventory and let them solve their own problems. Because if I continue solving other people's problems, they're not really learning how to solve them themselves. And then the other thing is over-loving or over-caring, so doting too much. Being a helicopter parent is a good example of that. Rescuing somebody when they really need to feel those consequences on their own. So these are just some examples of what it might look like for a person with codependency or tendency to codependency when they're in a relapse. That's what it might look like. So into this model of relapse prevention, this line here represents our emotional functioning, and it's good, and it's through time. So Marlatt says we have this emotional functioning as we go through time. He says we encounter a high risk situation, and that could be a number of things. When I read this in the article, and by the way, as I go through this, what I'm showing you today is my take on this with the information that I gathered from Marlatt. So this is sort of like my interpretation of his model. So I don't think that addicts or codependents need a high risk situation to go into a relapse. So I just make it a situation, because I really can make any situation into a stressful or an emergency situation. I can do that in my head without it being high risk. Shown by what happened when I couldn't log in today. Not that big a deal of a situation, but in my head, I had it escalated to, oh my God, we're late. What are they going to think, right? So I'm not immune to this. So it didn't really take much of a situation to get my anxiety going. So as we progress forward, this emotional functioning, when I encounter this situation, my emotional functioning goes down. It starts to decrease, and I start to feel vulnerable. And what Marlatt says is that we really, the solution is we implement a coping strategy when we notice that's happening, and get ourselves back up to normal functioning. And a coping strategy are things that we've reviewed before, but it's like calling a friend, reading a book, going for a walk, etc. And so it's a task, it's a recovery task for people to devise their own list of coping strategies. Now, in the article, sometimes he calls them coping skills, but I call them strategies because they're not skills yet. So at the moment, it's a strategy. So in the recovery process, people try a number of different strategies, and the things that work and become internalized become skills. But at the moment, they're strategies. So many people think that relapse only happens when somebody's feeling bad, but honestly, most relapses, or a lot of relapses, happen when somebody is on an upswing. Especially with addicts, that happens a lot. When something good happens in their life, they find that as an excuse to use. When things are going bad in their life, they can find that as an excuse to use. And so in codependency, that can look like, oh, my son or my daughter or my husband or wife, they're doing really well right now, and so it's okay for me to let down my boundaries. And that's how a person in codependency would slip into this relapse situation. Or going down, they would think, oh, they're doing horribly, they're going to hurt themselves, they're in deep trouble, and if I don't help, it's just only going to get worse, so I'm going to let down my boundaries and help and enable somehow. So that's kind of what it looks like in codependency. So I typically think of things in recovery and relapse. I'm either living in the solution or I'm living in the problem. And it's super important to remember to be gentle with yourself when you're going through this, right? So really, this is it. That's it. And usually when I do this in a live audience, people laugh because they think that I'm leaving some stuff out, which I am. But this is the basic part of the model. I have a situation. I start to feel either too good or too bad about that situation. I implement some coping strategies, and I return myself to my normal emotional functioning. It is really that simple. And we do this all day long. Happened today earlier when it took a while for my computer to load up, and I started to get worried that I lost my presentation, right? So I start to slide and I start to panic and I think, oh no, where is it? Then the computer thinks and it pops up and I'm like, okay, now it's good. It happens in traffic. And I tell people a lot, you can tell the quality of a person's recovery by how they are in traffic. How are they when they get stopped at a train or somebody pulls in front of them or when they hit a yellow light 3 times in a row, right? So we're doing this emotional regulation, which is a tenet of dialectical behavior therapy. We're regulating ourselves all the time. And that's really all there is to this model, but there is a lot more to the process of the relapse. So we have a certain period of time to intervene, right? We start to feel this situation coming and we start going down. And if we're aware enough, we can intervene before we go down too far while it's still intervenable. So the first task is to have a good sense of self-awareness of my emotional functioning, right? I need to know how I am doing. The second is willingness. I need to be willing to do something other than my other best coping strategy. And the third thing is self-intervention. I actually need to do something to try to intervene on this thing. And so with that, number one, being aware of our emotional wellness and when we might be vulnerable. So it's a boundary that a lot of people maybe have trouble with, because even though they might not be feeling up to the task of having a difficult conversation, for example, they may go in and have it anyway, right? So and it doesn't mean you have to be hypervigilant. It just means I have to sort of mindfully be aware of how I'm doing emotionally. And I need to have boundaries around that, and I need to gauge what I can tolerate and what I can't. The willingness, I kind of joke about this in recovery circles because I think that this is the work. This is where the work is, because we have to be willing to do something different than our best tried and true coping strategy. And notice I use the word strategy here. So the best tried and true strategy for an addict is what? Using. Sorry, I can't have the interaction here. I have to answer my own questions as I'm going. So the best coping strategy for an addict is to use, right? The best coping strategy for somebody who struggles with their tendency to codependency is enabling. It's overhelping, trying to control, right? So I have to be willing to do something other than what I've used as a survival strategy for sometimes decades. And that's why I call this the step that has the work. If I'm not willing to do something different, I'm going to be dead in the water. And this is probably the hardest piece to accomplish, because my willingness varies as well, right? I might be more willing one day to do something different than another day. And the third thing is to actually act. I have to self-intervene. And I tell people that this is what my job is as a therapist, is that I have to work myself out of a job, right? And how I do that is by teaching people how to self-intervene. I can't always rely on other people. I have to be able to have these coping strategies in my back pocket, and I have to be willing to self-intervene with them, and in order to avoid a relapse situation. So what happens if I don't do this 3-step process? And by the way, this 3-step process is my own that I've added into this model. It's not something that you'll find in that article that I referred you to. If I'm not willing, or I'm not aware of how I'm doing, and I don't self-intervene, my emotional state starts to go down, and represented by the thin blue line, right? And in the recovery circles, they will call this the slippery slope. We've all heard that before. And once I start down this slope, it gets steeper and steeper and steeper. So if I don't do anything about it, or I start thinking about, well, it might be a good idea to help my son with rent. Marlatt calls these positive outcome expectancies. I have a positive expectation of a good outcome, right? So I talk myself into the fact that, with addicts, it'll be, if I use, I'll feel better. With codependents, it's if I help them, I'll feel better. but they frame it in the fact that if I help them, they'll do better. If I help them, I'm paving the road for them. So they frame it in a way that it's about the addict, but the positive outcome is not really about the addict. It's about, I need to control something to solve my anxiety about what's going to happen to them. So I have this positive outcome expectancy that what I'm going to do is going to help me feel better. He also has something called apparently irrelevant decisions. And this is exemplified by, I just go do something that seems apparently irrelevant to the relapse. Like I say, I go visit my son, and I go over there and he's in a really bad way that I didn't know about. And all of a sudden, I went over there just to have a visit that we had arranged. And all of a sudden, I'm in this situation where I'm faced with a relapse process where I'm going to be tempted to enable him. Right? So in this process, my self-motivation decreases, my self-efficacy decreases. I go into a sense of complacency or apathy, and I continue down this slide, and a person can hit this point of no return. So another side note is that this point of no return is not in Marlatt's model either. This is my insert. And it's just a belief that I have, that I know that my brain reacts to situations. I don't have to have the substance in my body to have the effect of the substance in my brain. And I don't have to enable the person to actually have the feeling of control. So I believe there's this point of no return where somebody has not relapsed yet, but now there's nothing that's going to stop them, right? So in the example I used about visiting, say, my hypothetical son, I go over there. I'm not really in a good emotional state because I'm nervous about visiting him. And when he walks out of the door to greet me, I can see that he's unkempt and hasn't had a shower that day. So that might be my point of no return that turns the key in my head, that I know that I'm going to do something. I'm going to pay his rent. I'm going to do his laundry. I'm going to try to help him in some way without him asking. So I've crossed over this point of no return, and nothing is going to stop me from having a lapse. And a lapse is a one-time act, a one-time use, or a one-time dose. So a lot of people get upset when I use the word lapse, but this is what Marlatt uses, and it's part of this process. In the old days of AA, they didn't make people start over when they had a relapse. In fact, they called it a slip, and they didn't make them start counting over. So having a lapse is just this one-time use, a one-time behavior that we do something that we said we weren't going to do, like enabling my loved one in their addiction process. So there's something that ensues from that. So and Marlatt calls it the AVE. And so if you think about it, when a person does something they said they weren't going to do, there is an effect from that. And he calls it the abstinence violation effect. So when I've violated my abstinence, when I have enabled when I said I wasn't going to enable, and by the way, you know that this is this article that I'm taking this from was written about alcohol. But I don't believe that it needs to be relegated to just alcohol. It's just like any other recovery system. You can just plug anything in there and it'll work. So if I violate my abstinence of enabling, I have this effect. I have an abstinence violation effect. And what that looks like, yes, I made it a martini glass with an olive. There is an effect when I have this lapse. It's remorse, guilt, shame. I feel bad about myself. I start with negative self-talk. I get depressed. I feel embarrassed, maybe humiliated. I get a sense of apathy. And then, of course, my one of my favorite non-clinical terms is a case of the efforts. And when I get to that point, if I don't do anything about it, I end up in a full-blown relapse. And so this is the process that happens when somebody, and so that full-blown relapse for a codependent would look like paying rent again, month after month after month. filling the tank with gas for them week after week after week. I'm in this full-blown relapse. I've let my boundaries down, and now I'm off to the races. So as we go through this sine wave that you see going through the middle, this is the normal emotional variance for normal people. And I sort of had this realization one time that families with addiction experience don't have a normal emotional variance. Their emotional range looks more like this. They have steep valleys and high mountains. And when they go down fast. And you've seen this happen with addicts, and I've seen it happen with codependents. When that situation happens, they start to catastrophize and they go down quickly. And so the reason I say that is my emotional functioning varies from day to day, and someday I might have a very narrow range of emotions, but other days I might be a little off kilter and I might have higher range of emotions, and it might take more attention to manage them. And so if you look at the red line on the left, the dotted red line, that's the time frame that it takes for me to realize I'm going the wrong direction and intervene with a coping strategy. And the scary part about this for me, when people have a high emotional range, is that if I take that red dotted line and draw it down to the sine wave there, look how close I am to the point of no return. And so this is why awareness is sort of carped about with therapists. You've got to have self-awareness. You got to have you got to know how you're functioning as you're walking through your day. And my reasoning for that is that when I have a steep emotional decline or incline, the amount of time that it takes a normal person to intervene, I have gone a lot further into the abyss than most people. And so I have to have a sense of awareness as I'm going through, and I have to be willing to self-intervene as I go. So the rest of this is kind of good news, bad news kind of scenario. So the other thing that sort of highlights this is that the point of no return is movable. So on one day, my point of no return might be up at the top, and another day it might be pretty close to that lapse. I might be more resilient one day than the other. And so recovery is by definition for anyone, addict or codependent, it's a moving target. And this is the thing that baffles therapists and addicts and addicts' loved ones to no end, because what I did yesterday, there's a saying that what I did yesterday won't, I can't stay sober on what I did yesterday. I can't stay sober today on what I did yesterday. And this idea that recovery is a moving target for all parties in the familial system, right? So one day I might be less vulnerable. For example, the situation where I went to visit my son, I may have been less vulnerable one day, and I may have been able to tolerate watching him in his disarray and let him sit in it and not be affected by it. And another day I go over, if I'm not able to tolerate it, I'm going to have a problem. I'm probably going to relapse. So that's part of the bad news. More bad news is that the time frame between the situation and the point of no return, it could be a few seconds to a few days to a few months. Same thing with lapse to abstinence violation effect. Same thing with abstinence violation effect to relapse. These time frames differ between people and situations. So it's just exemplifying the fact that recovery is this moving target. More bad news, or maybe interesting news, or good news. Sorry, I've got the good news first. I was out of order. Good news first is that if I start going down this slope, it doesn't mean I'm dead in the water. I can implement my coping strategies and get myself back up. So that blue line represents a recovery process. I can have a lapse and I can implement some coping strategies, and I could fill his gas tank, and then I can do some coping strategies and not enter my abstinence violation effect and get myself back up. I can have my violence, my abstinence violation effect, and I can implement some skills and get back up. Same thing with the relapse. In fact, that's where most people I work with have been. They've come from a pretty major relapse, whether it's the addiction or the family, it doesn't matter. They've come from a relapse that they've sort of navigated, right? And so they come back to get help. So there is good news in this, and it's not a done deal. The bad news is that after this point of no return to the lapse, there's no recovery there. And I always find this interesting when we talk about it, because that's one of the places where I haven't done the behavior yet. I haven't actually enabled my son. I haven't actually drank. But there's nothing that's going to stop me. And there's probably more of a discussion on that. And as I said, that point of no return is my insert. But I truly believe there is a point where we haven't used yet, or we haven't enabled yet, but we're not able to stop it. And that's the thing we're trying to avoid, is that point of no return. So this gets messy pretty quickly, obviously. And Steve and I were joking about it a little while ago, and it's kind of like this whole addiction recovery process is a messy thing. So, but when I wanted to create something, so I usually do this talk on a whiteboard or a chalkboard. And so I do it in process, and I do it more with interaction with the participants. And so today it feels a little different, but I wanted to try to replicate what I do in the chalk talk, basically, as close as I could. So the question is, like, what do you do with this? What do I do with all this information? Okay, this is great. And I hope as I'm talking through this, that people are sort of processing inside their heads. Are there any questions that have come up, Steve?
Sorry about that. No questions as of yet. I'll
Okay.
Interject as they come up.
Okay, sounds good. I know I'm kind of doing an information dump here, and so it's a lot to process. But the question is, what do you do with this? And I'll tell you how I use this model. So what I'm going to do is take this slope from the situation to the lapse, and I'm going to expand it. So it's going to look like this. So I just want to like stretch this out. And so the idea here is that from the situation to the lapse, we have a cascade of emotions. And with my clients, I call it the emotional cascade, as we do a relapse reflection. So the way to do this is to think about a time when you did do something that you said you weren't, and then track backwards. And Marsha Linehan in dialectical behavior therapy would call that chain analysis. What happened before this? What happened before that? So usually I process with the people who are participating out loud, and we come up with, well, think about a situation that you had a relapse. And let's talk about the emotions you felt. And these are the things that usually come up. So I've kind of, because we can't process them and brainstorm them out loud as a group, I've sort of put them together. So these are the things that people usually tell me. They feel apathy, they get frustrated, they feel angry, there's anxiety, there's fear, overwhelmed, they feel defensive and helpless. And so what I ask them to do is put them in order, in the order that they happen. And so normally this order happens like this. And what I want to say here is I'm definitely doing this as a demonstration and not to tell people what their emotional cascade is, because it's your job to go back and do this reflection and figure out what the order of emotions are that you feel. And so the reason I do this is that when you ask somebody after they've relapsed, you ask them what happened, and they say, you know, like, like say somebody asked me, well, you gave your son money for rent. Why'd you do that? And I say, I don't know. And they're like, well, I can't really process that because a few days ago you said that was it. You put the nix on it and you're never going to do it again. And now here you are. Well, what happens is there's an emotional cascade that happens in a very short period of time. And usually it's so short that we don't realize it's happening. So what I want to do is kind of stretch that out and take a look at these minuscule moments. And sometimes people can go through all of these emotions in a couple of seconds. But usually the emotion that happens first is fear. And some people will say, no, I get angry first. And I let people know that anger is sort of known to be a secondary emotion, usually preceded by some form of fear. So usually I get scared. For example, I'll just use my internet experience today, right? So I log on, it's not working like it happened when we did the run through this afternoon. So I get scared, but I'm not really noticing the fear. I think I'm feeling overwhelmed already because I start catastrophizing. I start thinking, what the heck is going to happen? But really the first thing I have is a sense of fear. And it's fear that we're not going to start on time. It's fear that people will think I won't be professional. Fear of not being good enough, you name it, right? And Steve experienced this, I got defensive. I was like, well, why isn't it working? You know, I'm trying to point the blame on him and trying to tell him it's not my fault, it's your fault. And then I have a deep sense of anxiety. The closer it gets to 6 o'clock, I start to get more anxious and more anxious. And I had logged on about 5 times before it worked. And during those 5 times, I'm feeling a pretty good sense of frustration. And I'm feeling a pretty good sense of anger that it's not working. I'm not getting what I want. And when it's 2 minutes to 6, I start to feel overwhelmed. And then I start to feel helpless because I really can't make the computer work. I just have to wait. And there's nothing I can do. And then I felt this sense of apathy. Well, and then I just told Steve, tell me what to do. I don't care anymore, right? So, I mean, even with something as simple as what happened with us today, it's really interesting how these emotions happen. And this all happened in a period of 7 to 8 minutes. So as I go through these, and you know, like I said, I want to just highlight again that this order of emotional cascade does not have to be congruent across the board. It will vary with situations and people. And the amount of time it happens and the type of emotions that happen will be individual. So this is just one example. Somebody's asking a question.
Yeah, Jackie asked, if the codependent is not in tune with how they feel, what do you suggest could be helpful for helping them understand their feelings?
Self-reflection. Read that to me again.
If the codependent is not in tune with how they feel, what do you suggest could be helpful for helping them understand their feelings?
A tune-up. Sorry, I don't mean to make a joke, but somehow, I hope somebody laughed at that. Like, I make a joke, I have no idea if anybody laughs at my jokes. If I don't feel in tune with things, I need to identify what is out of sync, right? Can you remind me of that, Steve, as we go on, the in-tuneness? Because that might be part of this emotional cascade, right? I might feel out of tune, out of sync with myself, right? So I want to highlight a little bit, and then we'll kind of come back to that for Jackie. So if I'm thinking about this Marlatt model, all of these emotions for this example happen in this order, right? Hypothetically speaking, if I get to this sense of apathy, I am going to cross over that point of no return, and then nothing will stop me from having a lapse in enabling or doing something that my codependent self knows it shouldn't do. So circling back to our definition of relapse, I think about, well, if I can name my relapse as enabling or over helping or something like that, why couldn't I name my relapse as something else? And so the way I use this is like, what if I just said, if I feel apathetic, I'm in a relapse? Because if I'm going through this process, I know that if I feel helpless, I'm going to have a sense of apathy. Well, if I can do that, I could probably say, well, feeling helpless is a relapse. And then there's a point of no return that's not going to stop me from feeling helpless. And so on. Why wouldn't I be able to just name any one of these feelings a relapse? And you notice I walk it all the way back to fear. And so that out of tune, out of sync nature that was asked about can be put into this. And so I can actually name feeling out of tune as a relapse. I'm feeling, and actually, you know, I would tell Jackie that the awareness that you're out of tune is actually a positive thing because you're aware that it's happening, right? So in that, I have to go back to this very basic three things. I'm aware that I'm out of tune. And it can happen with any one of these emotions, right? But the idea with this relapse prevention for me is notice how far back I am moving myself from the actual lapse by attending to my emotional cascade and trying to frame those as my relapses instead of the behavior of enabling, overloving, overhelping, overcaring, etc. I create a different viewpoint, a different lens of what relapse looks like for me. And so I walk myself back because if I'm addressing my fears, look how far away I am from the actual lapse and danger of full-blown relapse. So the fact that Jackie is aware of being out of tune, I take that as a positive piece of data, right? Because if I know I'm out of tune or out of sync or helpless or fearful or any one of those things, I know that I can do something about it. So then I have to be willing. And so what people are, and I know this is what happens when somebody asks a question, then I kind of focus on it and I use it as the example. So the question was, what do I do, right? What can I do if I feel out of tune, right, Steve?
I think she's asking a little bit more of for another person. If the other person is out of tune, how do you help them recognize and understand what they're feeling better?
So if another person is out of tune and you're trying to help them without their permission or request, I would call that a codependent relapse. So I was framing it as if Jackie is aware that she's out of tune. And so when they ask me, what can I do? I will say, well, what have you tried so far? Because it's that person's job to devise and brainstorm and create their list of coping strategies. Now, if I think of this from another direction where there's a person in my family or a loved one who's feeling out of tune, what should I do? If they're asking for help, it changes things. If they're out of tune and I think they're out of tune and I want to tell them they're out of tune, I'm in a relapse because now I'm in this place of I'm feeling fearful because they're out of tune and what's going to happen if they're out of tune. And somehow as a codependent, I might want to try to control that. I want to get them back in tune because if they're out of tune, they might relapse. Is that along the lines of what she was asking?
I believe so. If we're incorrect, Jackie, you feel free to type in the text.
So if somebody in my life is out of tune, my job is to tolerate their out of tuneness. That sounds like a horrible thing to say to someone, doesn't it? I'm seeing somebody in my life who's struggling. And the therapist says, let them struggle. And your job is to tolerate them struggling. But this is what the job is. We are all trying to tolerate discourse, frustration. And people who struggle with codependency solve their problems, solve their anxiety through control. So if I'm struggling with codependency and I see somebody struggling, my solution is to solve whatever problem they're struggling with, not so they feel better, but so they feel better so I don't have to watch them struggle. My problem is that I can't tolerate somebody in discord. Now, as I say that, I mean, the end result of addiction we know is not a good sight and not a good outcome, because it is a life and death situation for a lot of people. So to ask somebody to tolerate another person who they love in their life in a struggle, that's a tall order. And we talked about that in some of the other webinars. But I still need to be willing to do something different. And so for a codependent, if I see somebody struggling, my best coping strategy is to cover up their problem, solve their problem, fix their problem. And I do all of that with most of the time without their permission, right? When they could solve their problem themselves. Instead of intervening with something else, like practicing a meditative practice, noticing that I'm feeling uneasy, notice that I have an urge to control this other person by solving their problems, and doing something different by calling someone and talking about it, which, is kind of what happened today. Somebody asks a question and they get a different perspective on things, and I hope it's helpful. But so it really does boil down to this simple process of being aware of how we're doing, being willing to do something different with a healthy coping strategy, and self-intervening until I can get myself back up to this normal dark blue line of happy emotional functioning. So there you have it. Did any other questions pop up as we're kind of looking at this thing?
We haven't had any other questions pop up at the moment, but now's a great time if any of you have any questions to type them in the Q&A function.
I know that was super fast and a lot of information at one time, but I'd be happy to field a couple questions if somebody has them. I know there's probably a lot. Whenever I do this talk, people are usually thinking and they're putting themselves in this model and in the things I'm saying and trying to apply it. So I imagine there's a lot of questions, and some people are maybe overwhelmed with the amount of info I just dumped on them. So.
Priscilla wants to know if she can get a copy of the webinar. We will upload this to YouTube, and I'll be sending a PDF out of this as well. If you signed up via Eventbrite, we'll be mailing it to that email address tomorrow. Gerald says this was great insight, great working, and transferable experience. Callie would like to know where she could find the other videos. If you visit AspenRidge Recovery's YouTube page, you can find the rest of the sessions before this posted online. And the link I'll be sending out tomorrow morning to your email address will show the landing page will have all the other addresses, sessions as well.
I can't see the rest of Megan's question. I wanted you to know that I did have a question about
generalizing this approach for everyday things like the internet.
You can't see the question and answer box on the screen, can you?
Oh no, I can. Megan wanted to know. I just wanted to let you know.
I'm gonna stop sharing because there we go. You might want to cut that last part out where the question box comes up because it has people's names on it, Steve. Okay? When we get to that part of the recording, make sure that that gets cut off. Okay?
Yep, absolutely.
Read me the question from Megan again.
I just wanted to let you know that I did have a question about generalizing this approach for everyday things, like the internet example you gave.
Yeah, I am an advocate for this whole process of change, self-awareness, self-regulation. Um, I don't believe, like this particular model that we're looking at um, was devised over alcohol abuse research. But you can just plug anything into it. You could plug in internet addiction, gaming addiction, sex addiction, shopping, codependency, enabling. I mean, you just name it, overeating, undereating. Really, the process of change. Sorry, I was going to go back to this. It's kind of it always goes back to this. Here's a really complicated explanation of a really simple process. And so Megan's right that I do believe that you can plug really any affliction into the stages of change, into this model of relapse prevention, into the motivational interviewing, into any of the things we talked about. It can cross over to anything that I'm trying to change in my life. So that's a great question.
We got a couple from Gerald. It says, as far as a relapse prevention plan, do you ever start with a commitment to treatment or contract?
So I think that the outcome of treatment is directly related to the level of ownership a person takes. And sometimes when somebody's coming into the treatment process, they're not exactly sure of how much ownership they're willing to take. So I don't force that on them, but I do try to get some level of ownership that they're here, especially with codependent people or people who just struggle with codependency. They typically will want to focus on how to take care of their addict, right? And so I would ask for a commitment up front to take ownership, to work on taking care of themselves instead. And the same thing with addiction, people who are struggling with addiction, their level of buy-in, their level of ownership is directly relational to the outcome, the likelihood of a good outcome. So I want to get as much buy-in as possible, but that buy-in is sort of progressive, and sometimes sometimes it comes and it goes, right? So the buy-in is always sort of on my radar as far as a person's readiness for change, their level of motivation, etc. So that's kind of it depends answer. So it depends on who's in my office when we're doing it. But yeah, there's always a request or an assessment of how much buy-in that person has.
Gerald had a follow-up question as well. Can you give a couple examples of homework or action steps to help meet the goals of treatment?
Yeah, I would go back to the emotional, when you get the PDF of this, go to that slide with the cascade, the emotional cascade, and think about a time where you did something, and I'm assuming it's codependent related, when you did something in your codependency process that you said you didn't want to do or weren't going to do, or you were trying to decrease the frequency of. Find a time, and I had a professor that always says, he would ask for examples from his participants, and he would always say, pick something between dental floss and divorce. So don't pick the most difficult relapse you've had, and don't pick the easiest relapse, but pick something in the middle, and then do a chain analysis. Do this relapse reflection where you're walking yourself backwards from the lapse. How was I feeling right before I did the thing I said I wasn't going to do? And then how was I feeling right before that? And how was I feeling right before that? And this cascade of emotions can, as I said, be a very quick process. So I always use this sort of visual of like, I want to stretch this piece of time out and sort of name those emotions that I'm feeling. That would be one thing is so to gain awareness of relapse, I must do a reflection on my previous relapses so that I can apply what I can learn from that to new situations that might arise. So that would be my first assignment for someone, is to pick something that you said you weren't going to do that you did, and then tell me the story of how you got there. But do it in a backwards order, right? Walk yourself back.
We've got one more question. Do you ever start with any education towards family dynamics, like narcissistic parents or transgenerational aspects of attachment and codependency? And can you comment on how culture impacts your work?
Read it to me again. That was.
Do you ever? Sorry, yeah. Do you ever start with any education towards family dynamics, like narcissistic parents and transgenerational aspects of attachment and codependency?
Yeah, so it's also an it depends question. So a lot of times when I work with couples, and that's typically the what I do in my private practice, I will have them tell me the stories of what they want. So I don't start with education, I start with the story. So I'm kind of narrative oriented, and through their story, I decide what education might be helpful. So for me, the way I do it, I mean, I'm assuming I'm talking to a therapist right now, whoever this is. It sounds like a therapist asking the question, that I would be assessing what they need education about and offering that up during the process. There are times where I might go to a straight sort of educational thing, kind of like what I'm doing today, which I've done before, and but I try to temper that. I don't try to overdo it and dominate the whole session with just a psychoed presentation. But as far as culture and the sort of asking about co-occurring disorders in parents or persons who are loved ones of addicts, that does create, the culture informs the dynamic of the family. And there are stereotypical things that we would like to assume, but that's typically not always the right way to go about it. I try to assess the culture from the story that they tell me, not from any preconception that I might have. And I try not to diagnose other people that aren't present in the room. So if they are there, yeah, it becomes a situation where it's sort of like addiction, where you've got somebody who's got depression and anxiety and addiction, right? And so you have to try to treat everything all at once. When somebody mentions narcissism or one of the personality disorders, anybody who's a therapist knows that those are very difficult to work with, and that the prognosis of change is incremental at best. And so confronting that sometimes is not the way that I would approach it, but certainly I'm sort of thinking about the culture, the systemic functioning of the family. And so if I'm working with a whole family, those things would happen after I've had a few sessions with them and seen them interact with each other over time, where I've been able to sort of insert myself into the dynamic of the family. So I guess the answer to that is yes, I would do those things, but cautiously.
And it looks like you did answer his question, and he wanted you to know that he absolutely loves your slides.
Thank you. I really appreciate everybody being here, and it's been a pleasure. And I so much appreciate you letting me. I feel like I'm talking at people because I don't know who's here and I can't see faces, and so it's an unusual situation. But I'm very appreciative of you all. And please, if there's any questions, I'm going to send the PDF over to Steve as soon as we're done here, and so he can send that over to you. And have a great rest of your Tuesday night.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the